Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking more about the early history of our nation. This is right after we have elected, we have chosen George Washington as our first president. We have established Washington, D.C. And we are going to start off by talking about one of the first conflicts and actual armed conflicts that our government had to face with President Washington leading. And this is known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In western Pennsylvania, mountains made it difficult to transport bulky bushels of grain to eastern markets. So people distilled their grain into whiskey, which was more compact and of higher value. Rural farmers hated the excise tax on whiskey, which reminded them of the British taxes that had led to the Revolution. In 1794, farmers resisting the tax by intimidating and attacking tax collectors. Now, before we go any further, let's talk about what. Now, hold on. Don't get carried away when I first say this. Let's talk about whiskey for just a minute. Now, we all know what whiskey is used mostly for in the modern day. There is that aspect to it, but let's think more back in this time. Think about what people had access to. Think about living out on the frontier. You know, what are some other uses for whiskey? Well, it can be used as antiseptic. You know, the alcohol in it can be used to clean wounds. And getting infections was essentially a death sentence back in the old frontier days. So if you got a pretty nasty gash on your arm or something, it's gonna burn like fire, but you know, pouring whiskey into that wound to clean the wound is what might help you keep your arm and your life. So there was that. Also, let's say something did happen and you had to have a hand cut off. You're going to lose your hand. Well, they don't have a gas to knock you out like they do today. So you're going to get a bunch of this, you're going to drink a whole bunch of it, and they're going to get a bunch of people to hold you down, and they're just going to get a saw and go to town on it. So, and then if you needed it to get a fire started, alcohol is flammable, and it could be used to start fires. So there were numerous reasons why, even if people did not, if they were, let's say, a religious group and they did not condone drinking alcohol, they did have a reason to have whiskey nearby. Whiskey was used for a number of different things, like I said, cleaning wounds, starting fires, to help people deal with pain, if they had to, you know, have a limb cut off or something. You know, the frontier was a nasty place. It was a very nasty place. And whiskey was a valuable resource at this time, and not just for the use that most people have for it now. Hamilton welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate the new power of the nation by suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington agreed, observing, "We had given no testimony to the world of being able or willing to support our government and laws." Under Hamilton's command, 12,000 militiamen marched west into the troubled region. The rebellion quickly dissolved. Rather than resist such overwhelming force, most rebels stayed home or ran away. Hamilton arrested 20 suspects, but only 2 were convicted. Jefferson mocked that an insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against, but could never be found. So, Jefferson is kind of making fun of these guys, being like, you marched all those guys out there to arrest 2 people? Good job. The Whiskey Rebellion stirs debate. The Whiskey Rebellion and its outcome fueled disagreement. The Federalists blamed the rebellion in part on a set of political clubs known as the Democratic Societies. The clubs had formed to oppose the Federalists. Although these clubs were small and scattered, Washington denounced them as the most diabolical attempt to destroy the best fabric of human government and happiness. Jefferson and Madison defended the societies, fearing that aristocracy would triumph if leaders were immune from constant public scrutiny and criticism. They were alarmed that the Federalists had sent so many troops to suppress popular dissent in western Pennsylvania. As debate over the rebellion continued, the two sides gradually emerged as distinct political groups. The Whiskey Rebellion highlighted the growing division in American politics. The federal government, headed by Washington and Hamilton, sought to secure its power and authority. Meanwhile, the opposition, led by Madison and Jefferson, grew stronger. Political parties emerged. The authors of the Constitution wanted to avoid organized political parties, or groups of people who seek to win elections and hold public office in order to shape government policy. They deemed these groups to be factions that threatened the unity of a republic. Despite these intentions, politicians eventually formed two parties, the Federalists, led by Hamilton and John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. This party was also known as the Republicans. Northerners, especially merchants, tended to favor the Federalists, who promoted industry and trade. In contrast, Southerners, especially farmers, voted mainly for the Democratic Republicans because they believed the country's economy should be based on agriculture. Despite these regional divisions, Federalists and Democratic Republicans could be found in every social class, in every type of community, in every region, and in every state. Political elections were closely contested most of the time. The first two presidents and most of the governors, state legislators, and congressmen were Federalists. Their early electoral success indicates that they were able to attract a majority of voters. Voters credited the Federalists with the new Constitution and with the nation's increased prosperity and stability during the 1790s. But many common people continued to support the Democratic Republicans. They worried that the Federalists would concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the elite and that the federal government would hold too much power. Democratic Republicans wanted the states to hold more power relative to the federal government. They and many voters also believed that the Democratic Republican Party offered more social mobility. In addition to building a government, making peace with American Indians, and maintaining control over expanded borders, the young United States had to establish itself in the international community during a volatile time. By 1793, Britain and France had resumed war, and it became difficult for the United States to stay neutral. Debate over America's response to a war and to a revolution in France affected the nation's foreign policy as well as its domestic structure. So, at this time, the French Revolution is getting started, and people are saying, well, we relied on the French help during our revolution, shouldn't we go help them? So, we're going to see how that plays out. Settlement in the Northwest Territory. Although the Treaty of Paris had granted the United States a vast new territory west of the Appalachians, the British kept their holds on the American side of the Great Lakes. Hoping to limit American settlement in the Northwest Territory, the British provided arms and ammunition to the Miami Indians and their allies who were actively resisting American expansion into their lands. In 1790, American Indians, led by the war chief Little Turtle, defeated a small force sent by President Washington to stop attacks against settlers. In 1791, in the Ohio Valley, British guns helped a confederacy of many American Indian nations, again led by Little Turtle, to crush a larger American force commanded by General Arthur St. Clair, pictured here. But the tide turned in August 1794 when federal troops led by General Anthony Wayne defeated the American Indian Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, named for the fallen trees that covered the battle site. Wayne's decisive victory forced the American Indians to accept his peace terms. In the Treaty of Greenville, American Indian leaders ceded most of the present state of Ohio to the U.S. government. This also opened the Northwest Territory to settlement. Alright, An illustration shows the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers, which weakened American Indian resistance in the West. Americans in the French Revolution. While the British were helping American Indians take a stand against the United States, the young nation struggled to chart a steady course in the area of foreign policy. In 1789, Americans welcomed news of the French Revolution, an uprising in France. Grateful for French help during the American Revolution, many Americans now saw the French as fellow republicans in a hostile world of aristocrats and kings. In 1793, however, leaders of the French Revolution began executing thousands of opponents, including the French king and his family. They also declared war on the monarchies of Europe, including Great Britain. In response, Americans divided along party lines. The Democratic Republicans regretted the executions, but still preferred the French Republic to its monarchist foes. Jefferson regarded the French Revolution as the most sacred cause that ever man has engaged in, but the Federalists decided that the French revolutionaries were bloody anarchists out to destroy religion and social order. They suspended that the Democratic Republicans meant to do the same. Washington declares neutrality. By 1793, Britain and France were at war. Both American political parties agreed that the United States was too weak to participate in the war and too dependent on trade with Britain, which provided nearly 90% of American imports. That trade generated most of the federal revenue, which came primarily from tariffs and only secondarily from excise taxes. If the United States entered the conflict, it would bankrupt the federal government. In 1793, President Washington therefore issued a proclamation of American neutrality, which became a foundation of American policy toward Europe until the 20th century. The powerful British Navy tested that neutrality by seizing American ships trading with the French colonies in the West Indies. Those seizures added to American outrage at the British policy along the new nation's western frontier. To avoid war with Britain, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a compromise with the British. In the Jay Treaty of 1794, the British gave up their forts on American soil, but they kept most of their restrictions on American ships. The treaty also required Americans to repay pre-war debts to the British. Washington and the Federalists favored this compromise, but the Democratic Republicans denounced the Jay Treaty as a sellout. After a heated debate, the Senate narrowly ratified the treaty, keeping the peace. In 1795, the United States also signed a treaty with Spain. American settlers needed to move their goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where they could be shipped to markets in the East. But Spain controlled the Mississippi River and New Orleans. To ensure a free flow of trade, an American diplomat, Thomas Pinckney, negotiated a favorable treaty with the Spanish, who feared that an Anglo-American alliance might threaten their American possessions. Pinckney's treaty guaranteed Americans free shipping rights on the Mississippi River and access to New Orleans. The treaty also established the northern boundary of Spanish Florida. The removal of British forts, victories over American Indians, and secure access to New Orleans encouraged thousands of Americans to move westward. By 1800, nearly 400,000 Americans lived beyond the Appalachian Mountains. By selling land to these settlers, the federal government gained revenue that helped to pay off the national debt. Washington's farewell. In 1792, Washington had won re-election without opposition, but he declined to run again in 1796. In ailing health, he longed to escape the political turmoil by returning to his beloved plantation, Mount Vernon. He also recognized that the young nation needed him to set an example by walking away from power, proving that he was no king. His voluntary retirement after 2 terms set a precedent set a precedent honored by all presidents until the 1940s. Washington retired with a record of astounding achievements. On the frontier, the American Indians had been defeated, the western lands open to settlement, and the whiskey rebels suppressed. He had kept the nation out of the war in Europe. A booming foreign trade boosted tariffs, which funded the government and the national debt. Many historians have concluded that without Washington's skillful leadership, the nation may not have survived the harsh tests of the early 1790s. In a farewell address, Washington offered sound political advice for his successors, calling on them to temper their political strife in favor of national unity and to avoid entangling alliances that might lead to overseas wars. Okay, there's an infographic up there that kind of compares two agreements the country made. If you are interested in that, you can read that, but I'm not going to read it to you. The Federalist candidate, John Adams, narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson in the 1796 presidential election. The nation voted along regional lines, with Jefferson winning most of the southern electoral votes and Adams carrying almost all of the northern states. Due to an awkward feature of the Constitution, Jefferson, as the second-place finisher, became Adams's vice president. Adams confronts France. Although honest and dedicated, Adams could also be stubborn and pompous. Lacking tact, he made few friends and many enemies. Those foes included Hamilton, who had retired from public office but had tried to control the Federalist Party and the national government from behind the scenes. His meddling weakened the Adams administration. A French crisis briefly unified the nation. The Jay Treaty of 1794 had offered the French as a betrayal of their 1778 Treaty of Alliance with the United States. To show their irritation, in 1796, the French began seizing American merchant ships. Adams sent envoys to Paris to negotiate peace, but three French officials, known in code as X, Y, and Z, demanded humiliating terms, including $250,000 in bribes. Adams broke off the negotiations, called the XYZ affair. The insult roused public sentiment against France. In 1798, the Federalist majority in Congress expanded the army and authorized a small navy, which won some surprising victories over French warships. To pay for the expanded military, Congress imposed unpopular taxes on stamps and land. So this is going to lead to the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists exploited the war fever by passing the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. The Alien Act authorized the president to arrest and deport non-citizens who criticized the federal government. Because most non-citizen immigrants supported the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists made it difficult for them to become citizens. The Sedition Act made it a crime for citizens to publicly criticize the federal government. Arguing that criticism undermined trust in the government, the Federalists used this act to silence Democratic-Republican opposition. The Sedition Act did allow juries to acquit defendants who could prove the literal truth of their statements, but that still put the burden of proof on the defendants, reversing the tradition of presuming someone innocent until proven guilty. In the end, the federal government convicted 10 men of sedition, including those in Massachusetts who erected a liberty pole comparing the Federalists to the Loyalists who had supported the British king. Virginia and Kentucky respond. Okay. In two Democratic-Republican states, the state legislatures passed controversial resolves in response to the acts. Written by Jefferson and Madison in 1798 and 1799, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions declared the Sedition Act unconstitutional. The resolves even hinted that states had the power to nullify federal laws that were unconstitutional. Though this doctrine of nullification threatened to dissolve the Union, no other state legislatures adopted it. Instead, the presidential election of 1800 would decide the balance of federal power and states' rights. And finally, the election of 1800. By 1800, the Sedition Act and the new federal taxes had become very unpopular. Sensing that trend, in 1799, Adams had suspended expansion of the army and sent new diplomats to France to seek peace. Those moves angered many Federalists, including Hamilton, who worked to understand Adams's re-election. Adams lost the heated election to Jefferson. Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tied. The voters had meant for Jefferson to become president and Burr to become vice president. But because the Constitution did not then allow a distinction between electoral votes, the House of Representatives had to decide between the two. Hamilton preferred Jefferson, so in early 1801, the Federalist congressman allowed Jefferson to become president. The Federalist congressman allowed Jefferson to become president. This peaceful transfer of power from one party to another set a valuable precedent. To avoid another electoral crisis, in 1804 the Constitution was amended to require electors to vote separately for president and vice president. Offended by Hamilton's criticism, Burr killed him in a duel in 1804. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.